Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you may be dialing in from, especially Aldershot. Alberto from Spain, you're very welcome. You might just be the furthest, but we'll see as other people dial in. Today we're going to be talking about how to build your data MVP. Specifically, this is related to the series that Cloudaeon has been running around how to help you get real-time analytics and how to operationalize your ERP data. So I'm going to start off with a little introduction. The statistic is clear. 82% of data is out of date by the time it hits reporting. 82%, right? I'm sure a lot of our panelists and audience members alike will have experienced that. ERP systems, enterprise resource planning, if I remember my TLAs correctly, they are systems of record. They are secure. They are large and monolithic, things like SAP, Oracle, Dynamics. They are designed to operate your business and operate it well. Our hypothesis, or our thesis at least, is that they're not super well designed to analyze your business. There's a difference between the tools that you use to run your business and the tools that you use to analyze the performance of that business and find insights, deliver better decisions, improve the performance of things. Getting data out of these large lockdown silos, ERP systems, requires a method and a principle. So we're going to go into the method, we're going to go into the principle. The key principle here is think big, of course, start small, and move fast. Start with one pipeline, one connector, one destination, and scale up from there. It's not rocket surgery. So on the agenda today, as I mentioned, I'm Frank. I'm going to be your host and guide for today. I've introduced the topic, how to build your data MVP. I'm going to introduce our speakers, and then we've got 5 parts to today's panel discussion about building your data MVP. First, start with the why. What is the purpose and why is it difficult? Second, how to establish the capabilities, the teams, the methods, the process. Third, what is the process? What is that method for building your data MVP? Fourth, running your first experiment and recognizing that failure, just as success, is an outcome of the experiment. How do you de-risk things before you scale them up? And then finally, crafting your business case. What does success look like? What do other people in your organization need to see? And then finally, we've got a Q&A with some pretty hardcore experts, I have to say. So put your questions into the chat box. We will clarify any doubts about the data MVP process, and we'll try and make it interactive as we go along. So I'll be reading the comments as we present. So let me introduce our wonderful speakers for today. Pete Williams, CDO of Penguin. Would you like to give us a short introduction to yourself? 15 seconds.
15 seconds, eh? So you said my name, Pete Williams. I work at Penguin. I've been doing data for 25, 30 years, I'm afraid to admit. And I think really in the sort of data leadership space since around 2012, 2013. So 10 or so years trying to help organizations come to terms with, take advantage of their data rather than coding and building reports, which is what I did in the first half of my career. So yeah, that's what I do now.
Thank you, Pete. Dom.
Hey, my name's Dom Orsini, lead solution architect at Fivetran. Been at Fivetran for 4 years now, and then previously was at Informatica for 5 years. So I've been moving and creating data pipelines for nearly 10 years, if I include some other career steps as well. So look forward to today.
Dan, our illustrious.
Informatica, Dom. I hadn't heard about that bit. I have to talk about that over a beer at some point. I'm Dan. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Cloudaeon. I've been in data since 2012 and enterprise software for 10 years before that. Great to have Pete on board. You're doing something right with Amazon, Pete, because everything I have on Audible currently is recommended by Penguin. My role really is trying to help our customers get value from data. And this project around ERP to real-time insights is something that's been keeping us awake at night for some time.
Thanks, Dan. And Raj, our Chief Architect. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So I'm Raj. I'm working as a chief architect in Cloudaeon. I've been in data for more than 2 decades now. So started with moving the data across for the different integration system and into the data warehouse. Then the big data came in and the lakehouse came in. So all the way I was part of data. So that's how, yeah.
Thank you very much. So there you have it. 5 fogies of data and analytics. Excuse me, industry experts. Part 1, start with the why. Why does anyone want to change the world? No. Pete, I'm going to throw this one to you first. Why do you need real-time analytics from ERP data? Why this data stuff at all?
The data stuff at all is a much easier question than why the real time, because I think real time varies a little bit depending on your organization, but the overall why is quite easy. And we had a quick chat around, the difference between enterprise resource planning systems and the ability to analyze your data. And I think the huge difference here is the ERP systems, all the other systems of record for the organization are where you're capturing and recording your transactions. But typically those things are on a short time frame. They represent a moment in time, and you're aggregating those, to get to total values, total orders, total sales, stuff like that. And that's incredibly important. Every organization needs that sort of capability, but it also needs the ability to reflect and understand trends, understand opportunities, to model the past into the future for scenario planning, for budget forecasting, for all sorts of things like that. And typically your large-scale ERP style systems are not configured for that sort of activity, exactly as you described in your intro, Frank. If you go back long enough, back to the days of like OLAP and OLTP type databases, these systems are configured to insert rows. They're not configured to drag back millions of rows to support something that you're trying to understand on a trend or investigative basis. So given that each ERP system is reflecting a part or a couple of parts of what the organization does and the transactions, interactions it has within itself and with the outside world, you're going to want to bring all of that together at some point. And so your only opportunities are put it all into one of the ERP systems, or take it all out of the ERP systems and put it somewhere that is configured for the sort of work we're describing. So that's the important reason why, because you're trying to move yourself away from, abstract away from recording the transactions into what the transactions mean for the organization as a whole and its relationship with the outside world and with its alignment to its business strategy, etc. So you have to do this. Do you have to be real time? I think real time depends on your organization and the sort of business you're in, the sort of decisions that you're able to take as an organization. I've been in organizations where overnight batches as real time as you can actually make any difference. And in that situation, what would you do if you had the data in the next minute and if you still had to wait 23 hours in order to actually reflect that in some sort of system somewhere? I think those sorts of organizations are increasingly fewer, because more and more people have got better data activation, although not all of them have. So I think the sooner you know that you can do something, the sooner you can do something. And in a world where you can deploy a digital marketing ad or a personalized message in a matter of seconds, configuring yourself to be able to do so gives you the best opportunity to react to the market and the news and the world around you. So the more you can move towards real time, the better, and the better informed that can be by the transactions you're having with the outside world, then the better that action is going to be. So those two things brought together makes a compelling case as to why this is important for me.
There's a ton to unpack there. Why is it so hard to get this right?
I think the first reason why is the differing nature of the two systems we're describing. There is a lot of there are a lot of people who conflate IT infrastructure and data and analytics systems, and they are not the same thing. They have different purposes, different objectives and outcomes. They're used by, I think, different folk, and the nature by which you gather them and the use cases for using them for are very different. So the first reason is that the systems are built to do different things, and therefore trying to make one do the other it's just like you sort of your old MBTI profile. Trying to be somebody else is incredibly wearing and hard on you. So there's that problem. Trying to do all of this sort of activity inside something like an ERP system typically has you brushing up against security problems. They usually have very well-defined sort of role-based access models, security models, provisions to keep data secure for certain individuals. And they only reflect, as I said earlier, a certain part of the organizational activity. So they in themselves are not rich. They don't typically have ingest mechanisms for other data. They're gathering transactions that come from feeder systems that they tend to be in control of. They're not typically built to ingest another database that might give you a flavor of something else. If you talked about marketing, your sales, your ability to attribute sales to a marketing campaign would say, I would do more of this campaign or less of this campaign now that I understand whether it's been successful. But your ERP systems trying to join two large data sets like that are typically not configured to do so. So they make that hard. Quite often, they're quite expensive to run. They're in large organizational units. It can be quite hard to actually get them to function in the way you want. I think the market for the expertise in those systems can be quite brutal, in terms of the resources. And typically those resources are more aligned to the ability to maintain those systems and improve those systems based around transactions and not around analysis. And they're not usually configured for the sort of AI, ML, data science type learning that we're trying to do now. There will be that in all of these systems because they've all been progressed and accelerated to take advantage of these tools. But those tools are typically to help them do their job better. They're not to help you do the job of analyzing the organization or your customer or supporting your business strategy better. So the way to deal with this is to take the data out of these systems and put it in a place that is configured to support all of those sorts of arguments.
I'd add two things to that. Transactional data on its own may not be particularly useful in decision making. For example, I may have a list of how much every single customer is paid, but I need to go into my CRM system to know where every single customer is located. Apart, they don't have much value outside of that department or team. We say, good old ERP, finance systems designed by finance people for finance people. But the second one, I think Dom is actually much better placed to answer than me. Why do you think this is hard from a technical perspective? I mean,
well, we face many challenges getting data out of these ERP systems. I think Pete's covered quite a bit in terms of why it can't do what we want it to do in terms of an analytics piece. So you have to get data out, but getting data out of ERP systems is tricky. I put it down to sort of three reasons: the sheer complexity of them. Some of them have thousands of tables. So understanding the relationships and how they all work together is almost a full-time job. So understanding that complexity underneath is difficult for a tool to do or a person to do. They're large. They store every single transaction. They're often been around for a long, long time. So the historical data within them is vast, gigabytes, terabytes of data. So dealing with that data, although we have the scalability in cloud and everything to deal with these types of volumes, and no one really cares about a terabyte anymore, actually getting that amount of data out of those systems is still difficult. And probably the third point, and the most tricky, is they're often quite locked down, whether that be from a license perspective, but also from a sheer access perspective, not from there's like firewall and technical and networking issues of people not wanting you to get in because you might break something, but also from purely a business team perspective of don't touch my data. So there's probably three main blockers that we face when we try and get data out of these ERP systems.
So there you have two very qualified perspectives on why you should do it, but also why it's hard. Let me tag over to Dan from the business perspective. Can it be made less hard?
Yeah, I mean, to sort of reflect on what Peter said and what Dom said, you're both completely right. I mean, Pete, I think the problems you've just explained match very well what we put in our ebook ahead of this event. Dom, technically, I think you're absolutely spot on. Can it be less hard? Well, I think so, if you look at it from a different perspective. Historically, people have tried to think, I want to migrate my ERP systems to something new. That in itself is inherently a complex task. Think about it, ERP is much more mature than modern data analytics. It's been around since the 70s. And if you've had something around in your business for decades, chances are you've customized it pretty heavily. So it's going to take a massive body of work to figure out what business logic is actually in the system. And the disruption that comes with that can be very, very lengthy. And with lots of disruption, lots of complexity, comes great cost. I think there was a figure from our friends at Fivetran said that 82% of businesses are still getting out-of-date data into their reports coming from ERP systems. If you try and migrate all of that, you're looking at a 2-3 year project, and you may not see any value. The way we would propose looking at it is to actually replicate the data. Take what's important to you, take that as a delta of change, and then land that to somewhere you can do better analytics. That's probably how I would change the needle on getting this turned into value in the shortest time frame possible.
Thank you. Raj, 30 seconds, please. How would you summarize the technical perspective on what makes this difficult versus why it needs to be done?
See, why it is made difficult is, see, each of the ERP system has got their own proprietary data, right? So it becomes more and more hard. It becomes more and more risk, because like what Dan or Dominic or Pete mentioned, over the years, those operational system has got those core values which has been built in. So that become more and more hard. And like Dan says, if you're migrating from, let's say, from one ERP system to the other ERP system, again, you're going into a shell of somewhere something different. But what Dan mentioned is moving it across instead of migrating it. If you just do the copy of the data, you get all the data in one place, which makes a bit more easier to do all the analysis what the business people wants it. So that's how I summed up.
Avoiding an oh crud moment.
Yeah.
See what I did there? Part 2, the capability.
A very technical joke, Frank.
Establishing the capabilities, right? This section is a little bit easier, right? So we're going to talk about, when you're building your data MVP, bearing in mind, we're going to talk about the methodology, right? How to build a cake, not just 10,000 different definitions for data product. We're going to talk about the tools, method, and skills, and then whether or not it's really necessary to go big and preview all 40,000 tables, or whether the business will want to see just a small data sample. So Dan, I'm going to kick this off to you first. What do we mean by data MVP?
Well, the MVP definition I have is a minimum viable product. I think it comes out of Silicon Valley. Can we prove something can be feasible to build it into production in a short period of time with a limited amount of investment from both people and actually hard cash investment? Can we build out an MVP in a short time frame for little investment?
So minimum viable product. That's the core concept. I think different people focus on different letters, right? They either focus on the M or they focus on the P. Very few people focus on the V, the viability aspect of this. Raj, why do you think a lot of these data use cases, especially around ETL or ERP migrations or ERP data in general, why do you think they fail? And why do you think people don't focus on the viability of that operating model?
Okay. See, I'll put it into multiple points, right? So number one, like we mentioned, right, within an ERP, there are thousands of tables, and people may not be knowing what's the business value of each of the table and trying to take them out, right? So that becomes more complex, number one. Number two, understanding those, let's play back a bit differently, right? So over the years, when the software evolves, the hardware cost and everything was so high. You get a memory, let's say, of 2 MB. Or now we are talking about the cheap memory cost, cheap hardware cost on the cloud, right? So when they start building those data in an operation, any of the ERP system, it has been normalized to the nth form, right? If you know those N1, N2, N3, so they normalize to the core. so that the tables of the data which gets segregated into multiple tables. So that's why we are talking about thousands of tables. When we build right now, we least bother about the memory because you got a cheap cost, you put everything as a flat. That's why NoSQL came in, right? So over the period that has been happened, so in order to understand each of the ERP system and understand the integrity and the relationship between those tables, it's become very hard for the things to get in, number one. Number two, see, not one solution fit for all the problem statement. So what happened is, within a ERP, you got into multiple business units, and each one of them, like what you said, right? You got a CRM, you got a sales, you got a finance system. Each one comes with a different ERPs, right? So, so that becomes very harder to understand the relationship, why this data is available and why this data is here, right? So those are the things when you're trying to build an MVP, you get lost most of the time. So that's where it takes a lot of challenges in actually to move them across from a challenge perspective.
I wish we had more than N+1 minutes to conclude that point. Pete, you have $0, but 10 people. What tools, method, and skills would you need to get this up and running? Assuming,
wow, what sort of exact question is that?
Hustle, you don't hustle a free license from Dom.
I mean, this is quite hard. So without budget and with people, I'm assuming I've got skilled individuals. Then I'm either looking inside my existing tool stack to see whether I've got something that's going to help me get stuff out of my ERP system, or I'm going to be coding something, which is how, to be fair, my team used to work. We used to code all of our own connectors where possible. I found that an incredibly lengthy, error-laden process that was very hard to maintain. So if I've got 10 people, I'm sitting down and I'm exploiting tools I've got, or I'm coding from scratch. That would not be my choice, though.
So, let's talk about what makes a robbery successful, right?
I wouldn't know. You carry on.
Neither would I, officially. You got to break into the safe, but you also got to get out of the joint. You need a getaway driver, right? So two different sets of skills, tools, and methods here. One is breaking into the data, being able to obtain, search, find the data that is useful, assuming that you've defined it correctly. And then the second one is actually getting it from source to destination. I think in the context here, we're talking about, a few places, Azure, Snowflake, Databricks, our particular specialty. So how would you characterize the skills needed to get data out of one place and the skills to make sense of it somewhere else?
So I'm gonna stick with your tortured analogy here, Frank. I think the key person here, certainly in my experience, is having somebody on the inside. Many of these systems, I think everybody here has touched on sort of the age of many of these things, how they start possibly small, but then they grow enormously complex and highly customized towards the local environment. The warnings about adjusting your process, not the tool, are often ignored. So you end up heavily customizing the tool when it becomes more complex. So certainly what I've found is the key thing to be able to know what to do and to understand whether there's any pre-built logic that's inside that system that represents the desired business metric, and how you're going to recreate that in the outside world is one of the key things. And it's often held up, I think, as one of the fear factors as to why you wouldn't even try breaking it in the first place, because I asked for this number, it's conjured on the fly, you'll never be able to recreate that logic. But actually many of these logics are highly recreatable, and because many of these systems have been around a very long time, the logic is also pretty well known as to how they're done. So that would be the first thing. My inside person is a must. On the outside, you've talked about the getaway driver. I'm going to assume that's my pipeline into, in my case, my Snowflake instance, but whatever database is your choice. And I'm going to want that getaway driver rather than doing my one big run into the night overnight batch. I'm probably going to want them to be sneaking out as often as I can, because I think taking smaller amounts quickly is going to give me a much better chance of success than taking all of it at once and hoping for the best, but moving slowly. So I've got my getaway driver, who's my data pipeline. I've got my inside person, who's my ERP architect specialist. I've got a whole bunch of people who are going to help me make sure that I'm bagging up the right stuff and carrying it across the threshold of whatever property I'm raiding here. So they would be, I think, business analysts of some form, data analysts that are uniquely suited to the system. And I think the person who's going to build my custom bags for whatever I'm stealing is going to be my data engineers. It's going to help me you configure that pipeline from threshold to car. And then the key people are going to be the ones who I'm performing the job on behalf of, the business stakeholder, because I'm not doing this for fun. I'm not just routing data because I can. I'm routing data because somebody out there in the organization is paying me a decent sum of money because they need access to this information. And in doing so, they're going to drive some sort of defined business benefit that's going to take our organization forward. So they're going to be the ones sitting at the other end of the delivery pipeline as the stuff comes out of the boot or whatever car I'm delivering it in to say, this is what I asked for, and this is what I can do with it. Or you've bought the wrong stuff. What do you think you're doing? Go back and get some different stuff. So, I think the involvement of the business stakeholder is absolutely key in making sure that what you're doing is the right job. And if I get sacked because I sound too familiar with any of this stuff, then you're going to have to help me out.
Always. Dom, more to your particular skill set here. We're not talking about removing the diamonds. We're talking about breaking in, and our job is not to steal the painting, it's to forge the painting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, I don't know if I'm going to carry on this analogy.
Let's
break from it.
Let it die a dignified death. Okay, we're talking about high volume replication versus other approaches.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, if we're talking about the capabilities, the tools and the skills should be further away, at the end of this pipe, right? I think that's where the value add is. You don't want to be wasting time. A lot of these MVPs or these initial projects fail fast because you go and try and extract something and a barrier's up, somebody says no, and everyone starts to give up. So I'd always say that when if we're looking at the points here of extraction requirements, go with a business case that warrants the requirement of an extraction. That's what my first point would be. You've got to have a team behind you to do that. The tools and the technology on the market today are very good at getting into these systems and have many options to do that. And it has a variety of security requirements that it can hit to get the data that you need. So I'd always say that as long as you have a good business case, the tools and the skill side is always to the right. The tools, I'd say, is more on the extraction piece. You don't want people building, like Pete said, you've worked with people that have had to build engineering scripts, and I've had texts at 2 a.m. to say something is broken. You want to get away from that piece and really trust in the tools to get that data out. And once that data is out in front of people, buy-in happens. Everyone gets excited. Everyone's like, wow, it's out. I can start building models. I can start testing things. And you start to get a real momentum, whereas getting issues at the extraction phase really stutters almost the excitement of a project or the budget of a project. So that's what I'd say around that.
Thanks, Dom. So Dan, next one goes to you, right? The merch, the goods are too hot to offload in one single go, right? The buyer will only take the first 1% to verify that they're kosher. How would you go about providing that 1% sample?
I'm really confused about how we got onto this analogy, but let's still run with it. So we've now got to fence the data that we've lifted in our heist. I think Pete's done a great job of describing all the people you need to have on board. The key person is going to be the person who gets value from this data, right? So if there are 40,000 tables in our ERP system, right? Do we need to shift all of that data and have people consume all of that? The answer is probably no. where's the value in our business case, right? What's the thing that's going to get us a quick win with somebody important who's being our sponsor for this project? If that's going to be being able to show how do we link our sales to our customers, and we then run a marketing campaign on the back of that that helps us convert more customers, we'll get a bigger share of their wallet, that's a win. Find a way to do that in an MVP, get somebody important excited about it, and then build from there.
There you go. Those are the capabilities. Let's move on to part 3. Learn the MVP process. Now, just to see if I can get away with it, I'd like all my panelists to stare deeply into the camera and do this. Dan? Come on.
I've got a connectivity issue, Frank. I can't hear any of these commands.
The point is, we hear 3-letter acronyms like MVP, ERP. They're silly, right? We need to take the work seriously. We don't need to take ourselves so seriously. A lot of this is really flippin' boring, right? So if you break it down into the 6 logical components of what you actually need to do, it starts to make sense. It starts to become a little bit more serious. So what's the MVP data process? Dan, do you want to take us through this from a high level? And then I'm going to pass out the technical detail of each of these to the rest of our speakers.
Yeah, happy to take a look at that. I think some of this is all born out of research. There was a study done with Fivetran a couple of years ago, which really opened my eyes to how big this challenge is of getting real-time data. Well, not in real time. So we talked about earlier with UP. It doesn't need to be real time. Just needs to be
real time,
not to be out of date. That's the key thing, right? Because if you've got out of date data and you make decisions on it, even a good decision on bad data is still a bad decision. So maybe not real time, but just not out of date. We then took that study and we looked at the reasons why it's so hard to migrate ERP systems, right? It's complexity of integration, it's business disruption, it's putting more load on ERP systems, it's software sales costs, but it's also incompatibility of language between systems and teams. And we had this at Cloudaeon, right? We didn't understand SAP as much as we understood modern data stacks. So we had to go and acquire a company that had that specialist knowledge, and it still took us time to integrate internally to be able to speak both languages. I'm sure, Pete, you've seen that in your world at Penguin. I'm sure, Dom, you've seen that in your engagements. Getting people speaking in a business-focused way that drives an outcome is a hard thing to go and do, particularly when the two systems are built for different needs and don't have compatibility at the forefront. If you get over those things, then you can start looking at ways you can conceptually move your data, right? You look at what is the ERP source we want to connect to, right? What is the important data that we want to get out of that? Once you map that out, you do an initial load. Take that data and land it somewhere you can do something useful with it. So for you, it's Snowflake P. For our projects, it's probably into Databricks, or it's into Azure or any other cloud data warehouse. You get it in there in its raw state. What you're then looking to try and do is turn it into something which is actually ready to do analysis. So medallion transformations is a good way of looking at it. Take from bronze, move through silver, put it into gold. And as you do that, you're putting more curation around that data. Once you have it, that gold standard, can you put it into a dashboard in real time, right? Or can you put it into a report that's no longer out of date? If you can do that from one source, you've proven the value in your MVP. You then look to think, okay, how do I capture what's changing? Now, what's the data that's actually changing that's going to update this in the lightest possible way? That's how you get value in or near real time from a project like this. Does that help you understand, Frank?
It sure does. I'm going to pass to Dom. 15 years of turning big rocks into little rocks. Good man. Shout out to our wonderful partners, Fivetran. HVR really is the best approach. Certainly we've seen best of breed. Dom, take us through ELV. ELV.
Yeah, okay, yeah, we changed it a little bit. ELV. I can talk around that, and similar to what Dan said, we didn't understand the complexity of things like SAP, and we acquired a whole company to do that as well with HBR. So Fivetran saw the challenges and combined with HVR to do that. When it comes to ELV, yeah, extracting data from ERP systems, these are mission critical systems. So extracting that data has to be as light touch as possible, and also is critical in terms of security. So they're the two things that come up. If we go to an SAP team, if we're talking SAP, they'd say, are you going to have any impact on this source system? And what security protocols are in place here? Because this is all critical data to us. So once we've sort of cracked that nut, and that's not a binary decision, right? So when it comes to extracting data, it's not like, can we have access? Yes, no. It's, can we have access to this specific data? Can we have this specific role? Can we have access to this specific file? And if the answers are no to any of that, we can say, okay, well, maybe we can go a layer above. Can we have access to the application layer and get data that way? It might be a bit slower, but as we've all spoke about on this webinar, real time, once they see the bills and they see the cost of doing that, they don't really want that. So you have different scales. So I would never go in and say we want access to any of that. And that's where tools come in to sort of be a bit more light touch. Then loading the data is the easy part. Extracting the data is the hardest part. Loading the data, like Dan said, you can go wherever you feel is the best fit for your business, Databricks, Files, Snowflake, wherever it may be. In terms of validating the data, so what we often say is, we were talking about Medallion, we'd go into a bronze layer, so it'd be very like for like. With something like HVR or Fivetran, you can do a compare of those once a month. But because we do this CDC, we just only get the changes. We don't just do full loads. So we just make sure everything's in sync and we can plan it's quite a resource intensive thing to do that, but you can do that if you do want to validate the data. But the validation, as you can see next to the data transformation, often comes further down the line when Pete's talking about aggregations and is this number the same as what's in the source. But that's how we get to the MVP process. We extract and we talk around that piece. I could go on for days, I'll be honest. Like,
I'm sure you could.
I could tell you you won't let me, Frank, but if anyone ever wants to talk about data extraction, definitely just ping me on LinkedIn. I'll talk for days.
Dom and Dan, let me tell you, I'm extremely happy with the way that you've presented the 6 steps and deeply dissatisfied with the conclusion that you have both presented. You have both clearly stated that the only way to understand SAP data is to go out and buy a company that does. This is the wrong conclusion for our target audience. Don't do that. Pete, set them straight, will you?
Well, can I? Well, I wouldn't know whether you need to go and buy a company to understand the SAP data. I mean, every organization that's using a proprietary ERP toolset like that has got a team that's specialist in doing so. Certainly for us, we have a whole team full of experts for our chosen ERP platform. And so for me, I run the data team. I'm all pipelines and connectors and aggregation and Snowflake and presentation through Power BI. So I'm lucky, I have access to great people who understand exactly how their platform works. There is always fear that the logic is impenetrable. They know how the highly complex systems are joined together, but can you produce that logic on the fly? But and that's where some specialist consultancy advice is required. And I've been lucky to benefit from Dom's time to help understand some of that stuff. So no, I don't think it's been necessary to go out and buy a company to understand how that comes together, but it can be necessary to get some expert consultancy help if you don't have it internally about exactly how your system produces the magical answers that it does.
Well, there you have it. We have the enterprise customer perspective. We have the perspective of an expert in the automation of data movement. And we have the commercial perspective, someone who's got over 300 months of experience in data. Raj, I'd like you to close up on this. I want to give you and your team full credit for building this sort of 6-step method now that is already starting to demonstrate very clearly that when you focus on one source, one pipeline, one destination, that becomes the engine of change. That rinse and repeat. That becomes the operating model, focusing less on the tools, more on the method. Chief architect of Cloudaeon, chief architect behind this process with Dan and with the Innovation Lab team. Walk us through it step by step.
So as part of the Innovation Lab, what we are planning is, let's take one data source based on the business case. Am I audible? So let's take the business case and try to identify the data source, what is it required, right? And then try to also understand what's the business value it's going to create them, right? And then create those KPIs, what is acceptable, and then take it into the Innovation Lab, use those extract, load, and validation, right? Do the CDC change, and try to show them how it comes in the visualization side. So end to end, right from any data source towards the visualization. So that's what we are planning to do as part of the process.
Thank you, Raj. So, part 4, running your first experiment. There's an old joke, an old story, rather. It relies upon 3 blind monks walking through the jungle. They lose their way and they happen across something that they don't fully understand. The first monk walks up to it and feels something sharp. And he says, "Watch out, guys. This might be some sort of weapon." Second guy says, "I don't know what you're talking about. This is some sort of column and it's soft, it's covered in leather." And the third guy says, "I have no idea what you guys are talking about, but it smells terrible back here." 3 different perspectives on the same thing. They were looking at an elephant, right? Different people have different perspectives. Different teams within the organization have different perspectives, right? The whole point here is if you want to work out whether it's an elephant or not, you need something multidisciplinary. So, Pete, how might you establish your internal squad? Who needs to be on there?
Elephant wranglers by the sound of it. So I think my internal squad, having done this, the people that are involved for me are obviously a core Scrum team that involves data architects and engineers from my side. Because it was a Scrum team, I've had sort of agile leadership in Scrum Master and a product owner in this situation. Somebody really understands what I'm trying to get and what's the important priority in doing so. I've had experts in the ERP systems, provided by my internal SAP team, so ERP architects and analysts. And I've had representation from business users. So in my case, my MVP was around the finance department and a particular module of profitability that we wanted to provide faster and better access to, and more detailed ability to slice and dice and truly understand what was driving the performance. So we had some representative, senior and analytical finance resources as well, and we set off on this journey together with some help from tool providers as well.
Like you said, you're quite lucky. You have a world-class data team that you've built. Don, you've worked with organizations of the other 95% of the full spectrum here. How might you see the need for that sort of setup? The data team, the ERP team, and the business stakeholders or representation. How do non-high performance teams do it in your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it becomes I suppose it's different. You do need that skill. If you don't have that team in-house, like Pete said earlier, you'd have to get some sort of consultancy help to understand that. The business stakeholders can't be, you do need a business stakeholder that wants to benefit from this. That needs to be part of the squad. Like, there's no doubt about it. Internally, you need a business stakeholder to get that value or want that value from the system. The rest of the piece, yeah, it can be consultancy, but it's like a build versus buy common analogy. Now, obviously, I'm a bit biased, but the way that we've seen teams is that they often come to us when they've had a failure. They've learned from a failure, and they've come to us and said, look, we've tried to do it this way. That's not working. How do we do this better? And we would recommend an approach with tools, consultancies. But I do think business stakeholders and ERP specialists are critical to this first experiment, because they hold the keys to the castle, the ERP people, but they're not going to give you the key unless you have that business stakeholder. The piece in the middle, you need the support to build it, but to go to your senior leaders, etc., like Dan said, you need those two people in your internal squad. The rest you'll be able to get.
Well, my friend, I agree on all points there, bar one. But let's see. Let's see if we pass that. Dan, how might we characterize setting up an internal squad? The point that I want to challenge from Dominic is certainly something you and the Innovation Lab team have found, where it wasn't black and white. It wasn't a binary approach that, you know, build versus buy, as you guys have taught me. It was very much buy then build together, because it kind of reduces the concentration of risk in the IT supply chain. How might you set up an internal squad where, let's say, they do have the expertise, but they don't have the bandwidth, right? Data engineers are few and far between, and they're always overclocked at 120%, right? What does that squad look like?
Well, I think the squad is actually going to be very much what Pete and Dom have described. I don't think we would do it in a particularly different way. We would be looking to be an augmentation of the client's squad, right? So we can't bring the internal champion. That's what Pete brings from the client side, right? That's that overall product owner, business sponsor. What we can then do is bring subject matter expertise to understand the ERP system, to work in conjunction with the subject matter experts on the client side. We can then bring more capacity for data engineering, data architecture, agile development, and we use an augmentation of an external squad, in this case, to augment the internal squad. It becomes much a collaborative process. What I like about this, though, is the term experiment, right? Experiments, they encourage people to try things out, and there's no real commitment for success to be guaranteed when you begin. If we take the view of, let's look at this tough challenge of getting ERP data into my modern data stack, there are a myriad of ways you can do it. Let's just try one and see if it actually works out. Everybody's brought more on board to do an experiment that way. So we become the sort of safe environment where you can try and connect a source to prove out a hypothesis. And the thing we do perhaps differently is we don't go and get access to the basis team, or try and go through a data processing agreement, or loads of lines of infosec requirements, or getting access to PII data. What we would do is spin up an environment which reflects the source system you're trying to connect to and reflect the target you're trying to get that data to. We do that, and then we can take a small sample set of data and do some synthetic data generation on top of that. What that gives is a really quick way to run this experiment in a very low risk, fast output way that can really help a stretched team that couldn't otherwise do it with all the other demands on their time.
I can't remember who sang the lyrics, but it's kind of stuck on my mind right now. It's Baby Don't Leave Me. Dan, it sounds like you setting up this initial capability, being a part of that internal squad, preparing for success or failure, making it an experiment gets people bought in. But what if I don't want an MVP? Actually, let me throw this to Pete, right? CDO. The CDO does not want an MVP. The CDO wants a working system delivering against the outcomes that he set in the data strategy. So why do we distinguish between, I'm going to ask Dan first and then Raj, why do we distinguish between the Innovation Lab and Data Foundry? Why are the two approaches so radically different? Dan, you can take that one first.
Okay, so nobody wants an MVP, right? Everybody wants a working solution, but the risk of going straight in for that production deployment, buying new tools, investing in complexity, there's a lot of risk with it. I think, Pete, you commented on this earlier. If you go down the wrong path of changing tools and people and process with a big, hairy, audacious goal that requires months of investment, chances are it's going to go in lots of bad directions before you get to that outcome. It's much safer to start with an MVP, prove it can be done in one use case, and then expand it. I still will keep carrying waxing lyrical about getting quick wins, right? You've got to keep these stakeholders engaged. You've got to show them the money early in these projects. Pete and I have been involved in this Data Leaders Exec Lounge for years, and the recurring comment is, how do I prove value from my data? Start with MVP, right? Prove the value on a small win, get buy-in, get more sponsorship, get more investment to go further.
And the fastest way to get started is to mail them a Long Island iced tea.
Or something similar.
Raj, you've heard of the quote, I do not want a 1/4-inch drill bit. What I actually need is a 1/4-inch hole. I say it to the marketing team all the time. If you want to sell drills, talk about holes. We all understand this idea of, inputs versus outcomes. What is the outcome of an experiment? What transformations are you trying to bring about as a result of running this experiment? Instead of doing more work, doing the right work, instead of, debating, let's get on with experimenting. Instead of being a data team, we want to become a data company because this becomes a way of working. What kind of transformations can come about from this new way of thinking? Experiment, MVP, then scale it up.
See, the idea behind the overall innovation lab, right? See, any decision if you want to take, and the decision needs to be based on the facts, right? So as an architect, if I take any decisions or the key design decisions, if I take it, I need to have the rationale behind why I've chosen them, right? And what makes me to choose that as an architect. Even if I want to go and get a buy-in from my CFO, for an example, right? I also need to create them an ROI. This is my investment which I wanted, and this is what the return I'm going to get, right? So without doing any of the experiment, I can't able to take any decision in which direction do I need to go for. So the output of this one is actually, as a CDO, or let's say who are the sponsor, they would understand, okay, am I going in the right direction? Am I choose the right technology to do what I wanted? Am I getting the returns in back if I'm trying to invest in any of the tool which I wanted? So that's an output of it.
For the life of me, I can't remember why I put executive earworms in here as a bullet point. It sounds quite painful.
I think it was around, the quick win stuff.
Yeah.
Get some stories that get execs excited, like Dan was saying, you solve a small problem, you get sponsorship attraction, you get to solve a bigger problem. So you need those little things that start to get repeated around the organization to demonstrate that what you built and what you've done is actually adding value and it's making a change on things.
Very good. I've got a very good earworm for all the executives watching this on-demand replay. 100% of people who confuse correlation with causation end up dying. Did you know that? Part 5, the self-writing business case. Dan, why do we start with problem statements?
Because we've got to try and figure out what is it we're actually trying to solve. If you go back to your very first slide, Frank, right? Why are we doing this, right? What is it that is the current state that we don't like? And maybe that's we need to try and save some operational cost, or we need to try and drive more capability, or we want to try and optimize our ability to take advantage of some market condition. All of those things are viable, but unless we know what the current state is, how do we know what it is we're trying to change, and how do we know the future state will actually be valuable for us?
And Dom, what sort of KPIs might be tracked, right? So it's not just, volume and velocity. What are the most important KPIs that data leaders or really business decision makers who aren't data literate what are the sort of KPIs that they could look at in order to make an informed decision about whether it's good or bad from looking at the before and after?
It's probably more of a Pete question, to be honest. But
all right, thanks, Dom. That's all we've got time for. Pete, over to you. What KPIs?
I just get the data to Pete. He does the KPIs.
So, I mean, one of the most important ones on these sort of processes, I mean, it comes back to the problem statement. I mean, for me, a lot of the problem statement is going to highlight how you're going to measure your success. Certainly, most of the use cases that I've asked to be generated. But I think some of the things that you're going to involve with here are you meeting the expectations? If you've laid out a speed expectation, we talked about real time versus real time for the organization. Are you landing in that? Are you landing a sufficient grain of data? I'm on a massive data quality journey right now. So even if you've got it across, is it usable? Is it good? Or is it corrupted or not complete? Have you misunderstood? One of the ones I see quite often is timestamps. If you're taking like small feeds all the time, but your organization demands a snapshot in time, what's the stock value at the end of day, etc. What is your end of day? And do your timestamps align with that? So things like that start to become important as measurable metrics. But I think when you get above that, and these systems move from a demonstration of what you could be doing to the operation of how you are doing, I think then, like all systems like this, you've got to start looking at cost. It's very easy to blow your budget by configuring every cloud connector and every SaaS platform you can find. So how do you start to run these things most efficiently to achieve the business outcomes, but not to consume a huge amount of budget by not understanding what you're doing? So that started to become a focus for me. So you're balancing here the sort of business outcomes and objectives with what's going on in the data platform. You're bringing the right data, but not too much data. It's got appropriate security, not the wrong people getting to it, and you can afford to keep running that operation. And the cost of running it is suitable for what you're now doing with it. You're not spending a fortune running it and getting very little value from it. So I think there's a whole bunch of metrics to be keeping your eye on as you go through the MVP and out into a business operation.
You can pass the ball back to Dom now and say, what about cognitive load? Right?
Yeah, fair. So
it's a real thing for people at the coalface.
Yeah, you're right. So when it comes to things like what you've got there, human engineer cost, how to remove the tech debt, like it's a case of when we're trying to do these MVPs, how much effort has been taken to do this, right? So how much time has been spent to invest in this to just do a minimal viable product? When it comes to looking at those times, you'll often see that it's smaller than you think. When you have the right team in place and you have the right entries into the right teams, it's not as hard as you think. I know we started on part one. This is so difficult. This is really hard. You can do these things in a matter of weeks. We've done go lives in 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks. So the cognitive load and the time that it takes is not as high as you think. And that's probably one of the key takeaways I'd say to this.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we are at time. It's at 6 o'clock. I would like to get one or two key points from our key speakers. So if you could hear the round of applause from the thousands of people dialed in from all over the world, it would roar. Dan Harris, CRO, Dom Orsini, lead architect, Pete Williams, CDO, and Raj Kumar, chief architect. You guys are brilliant, right? This was a really, really good session. Let me hear quick takeaways. Dan, what's your top takeaway from this discussion?
I think identify what business outcome you're trying to solve. Get somebody senior in the business to be a champion for you. And then once you've got that, there are multiple ways of assembling the right squad. I think Pete's answer was great, Dom's answer was great. Our approach is great. And we all said basically the same thing, but focus those people on delivering something that's important to your business and deliver something valuable in as short a time frame as you possibly can.
Thank you. Raj?
Yep. So we have a team, and if we really want to test the water before we start any other thing, then this is the right approach to start.
Shameless plug for his own innovation team. Love it. Dom, top takeaway.
Yeah, I'd say don't be afraid to try it. Like I'd say that. Don't be afraid to try it. Don't think that you're not gonna. There's always an option that everyone's happy with. So I'd say don't be afraid to try.
Suck it and see. Couldn't agree more. And Pete Williams, to conclude, the necessary cup of ayahuasca on your data journey. What would your top takeaway be?
I think it would be daft to say just get it done, but I have observed that bringing this sort of information to light, getting to truly understand what's going on inside the organization, data being the golden thread, the DNA of how your organization operates. The systems we're talking about are the beating heart. These are ERP systems, and these large systems are the things that define how your organization operates on a daily basis. Being able to take this stuff out will give you so much insight as to how you can start making better business decisions that you'll probably be incredibly surprised that having undertaken what seems like a complicated project is going to give you a massive trove of very valuable treasure answers. So just get it done.
Thank you, Pete. Head on over to cloudaeon.co.uk. Under the Innovation Lab, you'll be able to download our ebook, Overcoming Cost and Complexity, How to Unlock Real-Time Insights with the Cloudaeon Innovation Lab. This is a fantastic bit of engineering-led thinking.